In the summer of 1995, in a quiet town nestled in the hills of Vermont, where maple trees lined the roads and white porches carried the smell of old books and iced tea, Daniel Whitaker, a 31-year-old piano technician from Boston, inherited his grandmother's house after her passing. The house had stood since before the Great Depression, its timbers weathered, its roof creaking like it remembered too much. Daniel hadn't been there since he was a boy, when summers still smelled of cherry pie and the floorboards seemed bigger beneath his tiny feet. Now, the air inside was still, thick with dust and lavender oil, his grandmother's favorite. On the second day, as a summer storm gathered outside and thunder rolled softly over the valley, Daniel climbed to the attic, flashlight in hand, half expecting to find only boxes of faded linens and forgotten Christmas ornaments. Instead, he found a mahogany upright piano covered in a moth-eaten quilt, wedged against the far wall beneath a small dormer window. It bore the name Chickering & Sons, a Boston-made piece from the early 1900s. The ivory keys were yellowed, and the wood bore scratches like old scars. Daniel, moved by a strange mixture of duty and nostalgia, decided then and there to restore it, not just for the instrument, but for the memory of the woman who had once filled this home with music. As he removed the front panel just above the keys to inspect the hammers, something shifted behind the soundboard, a dull thump. Curious, he reached in and pulled out a bundle wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. Inside were a dozen old letters, carefully folded, their paper brittle but intact. Each envelope was addressed in careful handwriting. To Mrs. Margaret Whitaker, personal. The return address was always the same. Private First Class Thomas Whitaker, 2nd Infantry Division. Daniel froze. Whitaker, his last name, and Margaret, that was his grandmother. But Thomas, he had never heard that name mentioned. Not by his mother, not by his uncles. The family had spoken of World War II, of ration books and victory gardens, but never of a soldier named Thomas. Daniel felt a chill rise beneath his skin, as if the room had inhaled, as if the past had been waiting. He opened the first letter. It was dated February 12th, 1943, and postmarked from somewhere in France. The handwriting was precise, but the ink had bled slightly with time. Thomas wrote of snow, cold rations, and the nights so quiet they hurt his ears. And in the closing line he wrote, "If you still play the piano, Mother, play that old hymn I loved. Play it loud, play it like I'm there." That's when Daniel realized this wasn't just about a piano. It was about a voice that had been lost, a chapter of his family's history that had been sealed beneath keys and silence, and was now asking to be heard. If this story is already touching you the way it touched me while writing it, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep sharing real stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. Daniel stayed up late that night, the old attic fan humming softly as shadows crawled across the walls. He spread the letters out on the dining room table, each one dated between 1943 and 1945, arranged in order like fragile pages from a story that had never been told. The handwriting was steady, disciplined, the kind you'd expect from a man in uniform. But it wasn't just ink on paper. These were echoes, confessions, breaths from a time when the world was broken and hearts kept beating only because they had to. The first few letters were filled with daily reports, the cold, the rations, the mud. Thomas wrote from Normandy, then from the Ardennes, then from a place simply called outside Bastogne. He described nights under canvas, snow melting into boots, the metallic scent of fear. He never complained, but Daniel could feel the weight behind the words. "I still carry that photo of you by the piano, Ma. You're playing Nearer, My God, to Thee. Funny, I can't remember what breakfast tasted like this morning, but I remember the way your hands moved over those keys like they were floating." And as with every letter, a portrait began to form, not of a soldier hardened by war, but of a son trying desperately to hold on to the softness of home. Thomas asked about his little sister Mary, about the dog, about whether the garden still bloomed behind the house. He told stories of the other boys in his unit, of a kid from Alabama who could fix anything with duct tape, of another from Queens who swore he'd marry a movie star if he ever made it out alive. But there was more than survival in these letters. There was hope and fear, and a kind of aching that Daniel recognized. Though he'd never been to war, he understood the pull of wanting to belong to something, to someone, to a place that still felt whole. One letter stood out. Dated September 1944, it was longer than the others, the penmanship slightly hurried. Thomas wrote, "We crossed into Germany yesterday. It was quiet, too quiet. We've been warned not to trust that. The air feels like it's holding its breath. I don't know how many more of these I'll get to send. If something happens, promise me someone will keep the old piano. Don't let it go. That sound, it's home to me." Daniel paused. The piano. This wasn't coincidence. Thomas wasn't just writing about the music. The piano was his tether, his compass. A wooden box with strings and ivory, yes, but also a vessel of memory, a link between a boy who went to war and a mother who waited in silence. The family had never said a word about him. Not once. Not even his name. Daniel couldn't stop wondering. Why? Had Thomas died overseas? Had he come home and vanished, or was there something more? Toward the bottom of the letter stack, Daniel found a single envelope with no address, no stamp. It was creased differently, as if it had been opened and closed many times. Inside, a single sheet of paper, unsigned, undated. "Sometimes I think about knocking on the door, standing there in uniform, and seeing your face one last time. But then I remember the look in your eyes the day I left, and I wonder if you already said goodbye." It wasn't clear if the letter was ever meant to be sent, or if it was a kind of diary entry, something private, too vulnerable for the world. Daniel sat back, overwhelmed. He didn't just discover a relative. He'd uncovered a man's soul, a man who had lived in the margins of history, whose story had been boxed up and pushed into the dark. He picked up the photograph that had fallen from one of the envelopes, a black and white snapshot of a young man in uniform standing beside a tree, his cap tilted, a faint smile. On the back, in faded pencil, "Tom," before shipping out. It hit Daniel all at once. Tom, not Thomas. Not officially, just Tom. The name had been there in old stories, in fragments. His mother had once mentioned a Tommy who used to build kites from newspapers. He was always your grandmother's cousin, or a neighbor's boy who used to help with firewood. But now all the blurred memories snapped into focus. Tom had been part of the family. He had been loved and then erased. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat at the piano instead, placing the letters gently atop it, pressing a single key, middle C. The note rang out, soft and true, and for a moment it felt like the house exhaled. He didn't know yet what he would do with the truth, but he knew one thing for certain: Tom's voice had been found, and it would not be silenced again. Days passed, and Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the letters. He read them again, slowly this time, letting the words settle like dust on the furniture of his mind. But something tugged at him, a sense that he hadn't yet uncovered the whole story. There was more in that attic than ink and paper, and he was right. Tucked inside the piano's lower panel, behind a row of rusted tuning pins, Daniel found a second bundle, thinner, wrapped in wax paper, sealed with a piece of string. These weren't like the others. No envelopes, no stamps, no return address. Just plain sheets of lined paper, folded with care, yellowed with time. At the top of the first page, written in soft pencil, "To Evelyn." The handwriting was Tom's. Daniel felt the breath catch in his throat. He unfolded the first letter. "I don't know where to begin. Maybe I never will. But if this somehow finds its way to you, know that I didn't forget. I never could. Evelyn." There was no Evelyn in the family tree that Daniel knew of. The name sounded like it belonged to a different world, one of wartime dances, Sunday dresses, maybe a porch swing and a summer kiss before everything fell apart. As he read, Daniel began to piece it together. Evelyn had been a nurse, a civilian volunteer attached to a field hospital in Belgium. Tom had met her while recovering from a minor shrapnel wound in late 1944, during a brief lull between battles. The letter didn't detail much, but the emotion was unmistakable. He wrote about her laugh, how it sounded like wind chimes in the cold, about the way she always smelled faintly of oranges and soap, how she never looked at him like a soldier, just a boy far from home. You brought me back from the edge without even trying. I wanted to tell you, but the words felt too small. So I just sat there and watched you peel an orange with your fingers and talk about your sister's wedding back in Iowa. Daniel couldn't help but smile through the ache. Each letter was a slow unraveling of a love story that had never been spoken out loud, not to family. Not even, it seemed, to Evelyn herself. Tom had written these letters and hidden them away, perhaps out of fear or respect or the simple hopelessness of war. In one letter he said, "There were 100 things I didn't say. I should have kissed you. I should have asked where you'd be after the war, but I didn't. I just thanked you for the bandages, and then I left. That was it. No goodbye." Just a nod across a crowded triage room and silence. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached the final letter. It was shorter than the rest. A paragraph, really. "If I don't make it back, I want someone to know. I loved her. Even if it was just for a few days in the middle of a war, even if she forgot me the moment I walked out, I loved her, and I think that counts." Daniel sat quietly for a long time. The room felt different now, not haunted, just full, as if Tom's soul had finally been allowed to breathe. He looked out the attic window at the hills rolling away in late summer gold. Somewhere out there, Evelyn had lived her life. Maybe she'd married, had children. Maybe she had no idea that for one brief moment, in a Belgian winter, she had been someone's anchor. Daniel wondered what would have happened if Tom had come home. Would he have gone after her? Would he have brought her here to Vermont? Would this house have echoed with her voice instead of silence? But those questions had no answers. Only the letters remained, and the piano. It was no longer just an heirloom. It was a container of memory, a witness, a kind of chapel where two hearts had once nearly met and where one had never stopped singing. Daniel made a decision that night. He gathered the unsent letters and placed them in a velvet box. He lined it with blue fabric, the same color as the ribbon that had held the first set of letters. He placed the box carefully inside the piano's hollow, just behind the soundboard. There the letters would rest, not buried, but sheltered, safe, alive. And when he touched the keys that night, starting with a soft A minor, the notes rose into the air like the last words of a man who had never been able to say them out loud. It took Daniel several days to gather the courage, and even longer to find the right words, but eventually, on a quiet Saturday morning, when the air smelled like rain and the leaves outside trembled against the window panes, he sat across from his mother in the kitchen, where he'd once eaten grilled cheese and soup on snow days, and he told her what he'd found in the attic of the old house. At first, she said nothing, just stared at him, her coffee cooling in her hands, her expression unreadable, like someone watching the tide come in from a shore they thought had long since disappeared. But then she reached for the letters, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the first one, and for a long while she simply read, not speaking, not blinking, as if each word unlocked a door she had boarded shut many years ago. When she finally did speak, her voice was soft and careful, as though the truth might shatter if spoken too quickly. "We weren't supposed to talk about him. That's what Grandma always said. Don't bring up Tom. Not in this house. Not to your father. Not ever." And with that single sentence, Daniel felt the full weight of what had been passed down through generations. Not hatred or denial, but a kind of protective silence, as if saying his name might cause something terrible to return. His mother explained that when she was very young, too young to remember clearly, there had been a photo of Tom on the mantel, in uniform, next to the flag, and that it had vanished sometime before she turned 10, replaced by a portrait of her own father, and nothing else. She remembered once asking about the boy in the picture and being told he was a cousin or a neighbor or maybe a friend who had died in the war. But she never asked again, because the look on her mother's face had frightened her more than the lack of answers ever could. Daniel told her about the love letters to Evelyn, about the words never sent, and the music that still lived in the piano's wood, and his mother cried then. Not loudly, but deeply, her shoulders shaking as though something inside her was collapsing and rebuilding all at once. When she spoke again, it was with a voice not of a daughter but of a woman, mourning someone she never truly knew. "I used to hear Grandma play that same hymn over and over. I thought she just liked it, but maybe it was for him. Maybe that was her way of keeping him close." They sat in silence for a long while, mother and son, surrounded by the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old kitchen clock. And Daniel realized that this shared remembering, was the beginning of something not just healing, but holy, as if every word they spoke was music being played across decades of unspoken grief. Later that week, Daniel returned to the house in Vermont, this time not alone, but with his mother beside him, and together they stepped into the attic where the letters had waited, and where the piano, newly restored and gently humming with memory, stood like a witness to everything that had been lost, and everything now being found. They opened the piano's lid together, and his mother ran her fingers across the glass box where the letters now rested, her hand lingering there as though touching the past could somehow absolve it. And then, with a deep breath, she sat on the old bench, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. Not a hymn this time, but a simple melody Daniel didn't recognize, something warm and hesitant and full of longing, as if she were inventing it note by note from memory and instinct alone. As the music filled the attic, Daniel felt something shift, not in the air, but inside himself, like a locked room quietly opening, revealing not horror or shame, but a quiet kind of love that had never had a chance to be spoken. And in that moment, he understood that the story he had uncovered was not just about Tom or Evelyn or Margaret or war. It was about all the things that survive when words are lost, when photos fade, when names are buried, and when music becomes the only language that remains. Once the house in Vermont had grown quiet again, once the last notes of his mother's melody had faded into the summer dusk, Daniel knew he couldn't stop where he was. The letters had opened a door, and now he felt drawn to walk through it, to follow the faint footprints of a man whose voice had been hidden beneath layers of silence, dust, and time. And so he began to trace every clue, every date, every place mentioned in the pages Tom had written, as if the words themselves were a map waiting to be followed. The most promising lead was a brief line from one of the last letters Tom wrote, a passing mention of a small field hospital near Bastogne, where he'd been treated after a minor wound, and where, according to the unsent letters, he had met Evelyn. Daniel cross-referenced military records, spoke with local historians, and eventually found mention of a civilian nurse corps that had been stationed there, a temporary unit composed of British and American volunteers who had operated outside traditional military structure and whose records were often incomplete or lost. But he got lucky. Through a contact at the American Red Cross Archives, Daniel received a scanned image of a handwritten report dated March 1945, listing all nurses and staff temporarily assigned to the Bastogne outpost. And there, at the bottom of the page, in faded ink, Evelyn Harper, Des Moines, Iowa. Daniel's heart raced. He followed the trail, public records, census data, obituary databases, until he found confirmation that Evelyn Harper had returned to Iowa in 1946, had married a teacher named Paul Armstrong, and had lived until 2001, passing away peacefully in her home. But one note stood out in her obituary. She had been survived by a daughter, Julia Armstrong, who still lived in the same town, and who, by all accounts, had become a librarian and local historian. Daniel reached out. He wasn't sure what to expect. Disbelief, hesitation, maybe nothing at all. But Julia replied within 2 days. Her message was short and stunned. "You have letters from Tom Whitaker. My mother talked about him only once, said he was brave, kind, and that he loved music, said he was the reason she never forgot how to smile. Please call me." And so Daniel made the trip from Vermont to Iowa, across highways and long stretches of silence, carrying with him a copy of the letters and the photograph of Tom by the tree, worn and soft at the edges now from all the times he had held it. Julia welcomed him with tea and steady eyes, and together they sat in the quiet living room of a house that smelled of books and lemon polish. And she told him that for most of her life, Evelyn had kept a small cedar box in her closet, filled with postcards from Europe, a folded American flag, and a handkerchief with the initials TW embroidered in one corner. Her mother had never said his full name, but she had said he saved her, not from death, but from the kind of loneliness that the war could carve into a person. Then Julia opened a drawer and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper, a single sheet of paper carefully preserved, yellow with age, a letter from Tom, dated April 1945. It was addressed simply, "To the girl who brought me back to life." In the letter, Tom thanked Evelyn for her kindness, her courage, and her presence, for the way she made him feel human again, even if just for a few days. He wrote that he would try to find her when the war ended, but he wasn't sure if he'd survive, and he didn't want her to wait, to hope, or to hurt. And so he ended the letter not with goodbye, but with the words, "If you ever hear a piano playing alone in an empty room, think of me. That's where I'll be." Daniel felt tears come, unexpected and warm. He asked Julia if he could make a copy of the letter, and she agreed, then gave him one last thing, a photograph of her mother, young, in uniform, standing beside a small piano, her hand resting on the keys, smiling at someone just out of frame. That evening, back in Vermont, Daniel placed the photo beside the others inside the piano's glass case, not as a mystery solved, but as a soul remembered. And when he sat down to play, he chose the melody he believed Tom would have played. Not a hymn, not a march, but a slow, gentle waltz full of pauses and longing, like a story half told and still echoing across time. By the time autumn colored the hills around the old house in Vermont, Daniel had finished the restoration. The piano stood once again in the front room, where sunlight spilled through the lace curtains in the morning and shadows danced across the walls at dusk. Its surface gleamed with fresh polish, but not so much that you couldn't see the small imperfections, the scratches, the worn keys, the places where time had left its fingerprints. He left them there on purpose, because this piano wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a witness, a keeper of memory. And now, within its hollow body, encased in glass beneath the lifted lid, rested every letter, from Tom to his mother to Evelyn to himself. Each page carefully preserved, each word carrying a life. People began to visit, not many at first, just friends and neighbors who heard about the soldier's piano, and then students from the university, a veterans group, and eventually people from far beyond the valley. They came to see the letters, to hear the story, to touch the wood, sit at the bench, and listen to Daniel play. He never gave a concert, but he played often, not from sheet music, but from memory and from feeling, slow, honest melodies that felt like walking through a dream. Sometimes it was the hymn Tom had mentioned. Sometimes it was the waltz Daniel imagined him writing for Evelyn. And other times it was something in between, a blending of grief and grace, of goodbye and welcome. His mother came once a week. She always sat in the same chair, the one her own mother had used, and sometimes she'd hum along or close her eyes. And in those moments, Daniel felt that the silence that had once ruled their family had been replaced by something softer, not noise, but music, not answers, but presence. One afternoon, after playing for a group of students, a young man approached Daniel and said, "This piano, it doesn't sound old, it sounds like it remembers." And that, Daniel thought, was exactly it. It remembered. It remembered the war and the boy who didn't come home. It remembered the mother who never stopped waiting. It remembered the girl who offered kindness in a collapsing world, and it remembered the man who found it all again, by accident, while fixing something broken. Because sometimes that's how healing begins, not with explanations, but with echoes, not with endings, but with letters. And in the end, Tom's words, the ones he thought would never be read, had done more than survive. They had saved something. And so, whenever Daniel played, he didn't feel alone. He felt part of something larger, a symphony that spanned generations. A reminder that even when history forgets, music remembers. We share new stories like this every day, true accounts that inspire and move the heart. Subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who still believes that love and memory can echo across time.